OPM sits at the center of federal workforce strategy. It is the government's human capital backbone, shaping hiring, pay benefits, retirement, performance management, and increasingly, the digital infrastructure that supports it all. OPM Director Scott Kupor joins us today to discuss his strategic priorities, the modernization of federal HR systems, the streamlining of hiring, and what it all takes to build the workforce of the future. Yeah, in your budget, your FY 2026 budget was really a bold vision out there. I think it's 4 priorities, if I'm right.
Yep.
How are you trying to achieve this vision, follow those priorities, but also at the same time sequencing reform versus modernization?
Yeah. So let me start with number 1, and these are not in any particular order, but I mentioned it. Early career is a really critical issue. So you've probably heard me say this, but if you look at the demographics of the workforce, about 7% of the federal workforce is under the age of 30. And if you look outside the federal workforce, that number is about 22, 23%. So by about a factor of 3 to 1, the federal government is under-indexed on early career people. On the other end, by the way, we have a huge cohort. We've got about 44% of our workforce that's over the age of 50. So if you just first think about that demographic, right, if we do nothing over the next 5, 10, 15 years, you have close to half of your workforce that at least, may retire or will be retirement eligible for sure. And we're doing nothing on the other end, on the early career end to kind of replenish that. So we've got to solve that demographic problem. The other reason, though, why I think early career is so important is I'm a huge believer in differences in experiences, like making people better, whether they're managers or individual contributors. And for a long time, at least what I believe is one of the reasons I believe we struggle with early career is we haven't had a pitch that I think is responsive to early career people, right? I've got kids who are 19 to 25. They think in maybe 2 or 3 year increments. And so part of what I think we have to do is we got to go tell the message, which is, why is working for government so amazing? You can do public service. You can work on really hard, complex problems. And, oh, by the way, I don't need you to commit to a 40-year career. Give me 2 years, give me 3 years. And you know what? If you love it, that's great. Let's find you a job in government. But if you find that, you want to kind of have diversity of experience and go to the private sector, that's great too. So we've got to kind of change that messaging. So anyways, that's thing number 1. We've got a bunch of initiatives there that we can talk about. Thing number 2 to me is, okay, if we can do a good job attracting early career folks, we have to have them come into an environment that actually is responsive to their ability to actually get stuff done and be able to progress through the organization. We have, every job promotion is a tenure-based promotion, right? And so we need to kind of go change all those things. And this is what I mean by high-performance culture. So I've been, managing people for about 30 years now. What I found is, look, the vast majority of employees, they stay at a place or they leave a place because they feel like they can come, they can do their best work, they can learn, they can grow their career, they're surrounded by other people who are, supportive, they've got a manager who cares about their career development. When they do great work, we recognize it, we can promote them through the organization. And so that's kind of the second piece is if we can attract these individuals, we need to reform all of the stuff in government that makes it hard for a high-performance culture to persist. So some of the things we're doing there is performance management. So you probably know this, but today we do a really bad job of differentiating between people in employee reviews. So everybody gets reviewed 1 through 5 every year in government, 1 being the lowest score, 5 being the highest score. And virtually 99.7%, so virtually 100% of people get a 3, 4, or a 5, which in theory would make sense, but you're talking about a 2 million person workforce. It's hard to imagine that literally every single person is either performing at expectations or well above expectations. And as a result, only 0.3% basically fall below that, meeting expectations. Now, that may be great, and maybe we'll learn that that's true. But to me, that's not a performance management system that actually differentiates in actual performance. But we've got to have a situation where, again, particularly if we're going to bring younger people in, my mind is they want to be able to be recognized for the work they're doing and progress in a fashion that is not tied to their tenure in the organization, but is tied to their actual merit and performance in the organization. Yeah. So I've given this example before, but look, if we want to hire a 22-year-old who, when we assess that person's technical talent, for example, for a technical role, if they are performing at the level of a GS-14, we should be able to hire that person at that level, notwithstanding the fact that in the current regs, like GS-14 would say, you have to have 10 years of work experience. So to me, things like years, tenure and stuff, these are proxies for merit, right? So if there's something about 10 years of work experience that actually is relevant to the job you're doing, then sure, we should test for that. But we've gotten into the system, in my mind, where we've got, quite frankly, lazy, and we use proxies for talent as opposed to actual measures of performance. So that's an example of, again, the second big priority, which is how do we create a high-performance culture that allows people to hopefully come to work and do their best job every day. And then the third piece is I would call efficiency writ large, basically. Okay. And there's I got two subparts of this one, so I will get to your four actually, but through a three grouping just to make the math easier. To me, there's efficiency with inside OPM, and efficiency to me, just to define that, is that what that means to me is can we continue to deliver a good or higher quality service, hopefully to the American people, but can we do so with lower cost? And those two are together, right? Because it's easy to cut costs if you just eliminate the constraint on can we deliver a better service. In my mind, that doesn't actually make sense, right? So look, we have to do the things that the American people want us to do, and we got to keep increasing the quality of that every year. And then we should figure out, look, we are stewards of taxpayer dollars. Can we use technology? Can we use process automation? Can we use changes in organizational structure so that everything we do in government isn't just we have to add people in order to solve increasing problems? So we're doing that within OPM. There's efficiency stuff. And then for the first time ever, which I'm very excited about, OPM is partnering with OMB, Office of Management Budget. Sorry for people who don't know what that is. Hopefully most people know OMB, but if you don't, we'll tell you. To help all the other agencies think about efficiency, right? So I'll give you a simple example if I can, just so you have a sense. So we asked all the agencies to kind of give us their kind of guesses as to what do they think their headcount planning priorities are for this year going into the 26 fiscal year, which we're now in. We reviewed those plans, and what you see in almost all these plans is they have a bucket of full-time employees, and then they have a big contractor bucket. And the honest answer is it's really hard to figure out that contractor number, but my estimate is we spend somewhere between 2 and 3 times on contractors. So probably $600 billion to $750 billion on contractors relative to about $250 to $300 billion on full-time employees. Contractors should be used for short-term type assignments, and or there's particular skill sets where it's look, the government cannot attract this type of skill set, and so we have to go out in the market to do that. Instead, we've kind of created this shadow FTE force in the form of contractors where people are there 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And so, what happens is you probably know, when you give people targets on headcount, for example, you often find they hit that target and then the contractor number goes way up on the other side, right? So people kind of play games. So this is a very simple thing we did, but for the first time we said, you know what? Take your FTE expenses, take your contractor expenses, put them together into one number, and then you guys should go figure out what's the optimal mix of things, right? And I'm fine if it turns out the answer is some of those contractors we should convert into FTEs. Let's do that because I'm quite confident, number one, that will cost us less money. And I'm also quite confident that the delivery of services of somebody who is a fully integrated member of the team will be much better and more consistent over time. So anyways, that's kind of an example of how we think about kind of efficiency broadly across the agency.
Just to reiterate to folks that OPM plays a very interesting perspective. It has a policy setter and a service provider.
Right.
And what are some of the most significant challenges? You may have already alluded to them, Scott, but that you face in that role where you have an inherent tension between being, I hate to use the word regulator, but it is sort of that, and a genuine service provider to the same agencies. How do you do it?
Yeah, so this is where, again, as I said, jokingly, we want to be go PM, not no PM. And I think what's happened, at least, again, and this is not an indictment of any of the people there. They've been doing whatever their leaders have told them to do, but at least as I've talked to people who've been in government for a longer time, I think there's been more of the view of OPM as regulator, right? And to me, that's just the wrong. I don't want us to do that. I think that's the wrong framing. In government, as you know, there are plenty of oversight and compliance and regulatory authorities, right? So we all have OIG, inspector generals. There's the Government Accountability Office, GAO, as you well know. We should be an enabler for those agencies to help them. So, for example, when we decide, okay, as we've done, for senior people in the organization, you should, not rank more than 30% of them in that 4 or 5 high category of performance, okay? What I think we need to do then is report on that and collect the data and then go back to the agencies and say, okay, you know what? Agency X, you're doing well on it. Agency Y, it looks like you're not. How can we help Agency Y get there, right? And not in an audit function like we're going to basically kind of slap you on the hand, but hey, maybe there's some best practices that Agency X is doing that we can say, hey, they've tried this stuff. Maybe, you guys at Agency Y should try this thing. So to me, there's a distinction between are we there to be an audit compliance function, which I don't think we are, but more we are a goal setting. We certainly are setting goals. We're doing those obviously in conjunction with OMB and the president. So it's not like, I just dream all these things up myself. There is some adult in the room who's actually telling me, either this is a good idea or not. But that's what we want to do. And then you're absolutely right, which is the whole other side of our organization is we are a service provider to the government. So we've got 2 kind of core service provision areas. One is health and insurance. So, we manage the, health insurance business for both current employees and annuitants. And then we also manage the retirement operations, for people obviously who, are becoming annuitants in the federal government. And those are, as you'd expect, they're complex, organizations where you got lots of moving parts and you have customer service and you have, underwriting and all the fun things that you do in an operational context. And then the third kind of core part of our business is called HRS, Human Resources Solutions. You can think of that I think of that as like a consulting-like arm that is there, again, to help companies basically implement their policy. So do you need help in looking at the organization and figuring out your optimal organizational structure? Or maybe you're thinking, unfortunately, this organization, you need to get rid of. You need to understand how do the rules about, eliminating an organization look like? Should you do a RIF? Should you do a DRP-like program? Like stuff like that. So that's kind of basically the kind of three operational components that we have in the business.
Well, you focus on the people, and I want to talk about the ways we get people on board, so to speak, and that is hiring reform. It's central to your agenda. Absolutely. And I believe there's an executive order, was it 14170, I think? It's a pretty ambitious target from, I think, 101 days to 80 days.
80 days, right. Yeah.
Could you give us just a little preamble of what some of the structural bottlenecks were? And what are the specific interventions you're pursuing to kind of make that reduction?
Yeah, so I would kind of describe it as like there's front-end interventions and then there is back-end. And the delineation is, when you actually get an offer to start employment, that's kind of, if we're before that, we're on the front end. If we're after that, we're on the back end. So if we take the front end, for example, I think one of the things that we do, so we own a whole suite called USA Jobs that you may know about that OPM does, which is kind of a candidate interface tool on the front end. And then it's kind of the workflow tool for the lifecycle management of that employee through the actual interview and hiring process, but often, beyond. So there's a module, for example, USA Performance, which does performance management. So thing number one that we got to figure out is like, what are all the bottlenecks that cause an applicant to say, today, I want to get this job and it takes me X amount of time to apply for the job. It takes me X amount of time to hear from an interviewer about whether I'm in or out, right? And, whatever all the steps are that take to getting to an offer. So we're tackling that in OPM. So a couple things, just, some of it is just, okay, can we improve the user experience so that it's not hard to do? So we've done some stuff at the margin, like there used to be these 10-page resumes. We now do 2-page resumes. My personal view is like resumes should be 1 page, not 2. So like we have a little bit to go, but we're 10 to 2 was a good enough starting point, right?
CVs now.
Well, that's exactly right. Yeah. So that's thing number one. Thing number two is the evaluation process for candidates. So historically, we have not used what I would consider what I call like assessments, basically. So if you're applying for a software engineering job in the private sector, one of the first things I do is I send you a software development test, basically. We just kind of basically stayed away from tests. And in their place came basically an applicant's self-attestation of their skills, right? So again, I would say, here's a software engineering job. Do you know Python? Yes, I know Python. Do you know C++? Yes, I know C++, right? But I would say like that's not a great screening tool because what people learned was we were using that. And so then they would tailor their responses to make sure that they got past that stage of the interview process, even if that didn't actually reflect their skills. So all these things add time to the process. So part of the assessment process to me is being much more efficient and much quicker on, are you in or out? Basically, do you at least meet the minimum qualifications from an assessment perspective? If you don't, look, we should just be fair and transparent with the applicant and say, look, this is not the right role for you. So we've fixed all those things. Then I'd say the next process is, and this is kind of in process right now, and we have a big goal on it for this year, is every agency basically does all their own stuff with respect to recruiting, okay? So in my perfect world, if I'm I have a background in, finance and operations, right? So in the perfect world for me, like what I would do is I'd be able to go to our USA Jobs portal and say, and it would say, flashing light for me, hey, you've got operations skills. The government wants operations skills, apply here, basically. And on the front end of that process, I don't need to know, does HHS have a job or IRS have a job? I just need to know that my skills are generally in demand across various agencies. And then what we OPM will do is do the kind of assessment and screening process. We'll do some interviews. And then we're now doing something that we call shared certificates, where I want to take all the qualified operations finance people and then share them with every single agency who's doing this, right? And I know this, like, again, none of this is like rocket science, but the idea is instead of every single agency going to every single college campus by themselves or putting up their own job announcements, and then, by the way, I may be a great person, but maybe HHS isn't a good fit for me. Quite frankly, the honest answer is we lose that applicant because we just close them down and we say, hey, that's done. What I'd rather do is say, if you're qualified, let's go give the agencies a whole set of qualified applicants. And then, quite frankly, let's let the agencies compete for you as an employee, right? So which agency has the best interview process, which agency has the best pitch that gets you excited, right? Like, I think that actually all those things can kind of create efficiency in the hiring process, make it easier for applicants, and will shorten that front end time. So there's a ton of stuff on the front end. Does that make sense, at least about how we're thinking front end? And then the back end, which I'm saying starts from, okay, great, we love you, you're great, we want to make you an offer. And how long does it take from offer to actually starting in government? And historically, the long pole in the tent has been we do a bunch of security reviews, and OPM does some of those, but then also now there is a broader system that DCSA does. That's the big area also where we lose a lot of time. So sometimes that can take 30, 60, 90 days just in that process. So we're working with that agency as well to figure out, okay, like what can we do, kind of maybe which of the things can we start up front and get going? How can we basically even get people maybe started before we've completely finished everything, and maybe you just kind of cordon off some of the responsibilities, but at least you're kind of multitasking on some of these things. So that's what we want to do. But to me, the very simple objective at the end of the day is like it should be very easy for an applicant to say, I'm interested in the federal government. These are the skills that I bring to the table. And then we should do the work of saying, great, you know what? Like we think you've got a great match with this financial operations job at IRS. And we'll route you there, as opposed to the burden being on me as the applicant to go search 150 different agencies and figure out what's happening. So I think we can do a lot better on that process. And you're going to see a lot more of this, what we call these shared certificates, these consolidated hiring opportunities going forward.
Interesting. I mean, for several years, I believe OPM has been building towards a skills-based hiring model.
Yes, exactly.
Is that, yeah, and I think I'm thinking the IT management positions pilot, the competency modeling work. I think AI and ML tools for skills identification. Well, could you tell us what's going on in this area, and how does this impact and get us to sort of a modern classification?
I never knew the words classification or qualification until I came to government, because I mean, obviously those are common English words, but they have a very specific government meaning, as you well know, and your listeners may know this, but there are, I think, 609 different job classifications in government. So, okay, so if I take one step back, basically, remember a fundamental principle of what we're trying to do is, as you said, which is there's an EO around merit hiring, executive order, around merit hiring. Okay, and the fundamental principle of merit hiring is exactly what we described, which is, okay, let's make sure we're hiring people for the actual skills and their demonstration of those skills that are relevant for the job. And let's not use proxies for skills like, for example, did you go to college or not, right? Do you have a college degree? Because look, that means if that's a requirement for the job, then that means if you were a computer science student and I was a Russian literature student, like we both satisfy that challenge, which clearly means that's not telling us anything about the validity of this applicant for, this particular job. The second big piece is an enormous portion, I mentioned this earlier, but an enormous portion of the step function of compensation and leveling in government is tenure-based, right? Yeah. And so one of the challenges we have with early talent, in addition to making sure that we're marketing to them in a way that's attractive to them, is we often have to level them at relatively low pay scales, not because they're not qualified, but because they don't meet the minimum tenure requirements, even though their skills might make it applicable for them to be leveled at a higher area, right? So in order to do all this, though, we have to literally go through every single one of those 609 classifications and basically strip out degree requirements, tenure requirements, things that at least in my mind are proxies for merit but not actual indications of merit. And then we have to create a new set of merit-based assessments and skills that actually allow us to interview. So we're doing that. We're very close, and maybe even by the time this podcast gets released, we're about to release the first one, which happens to be the 2210 series, which is the IT jobs, right, for those who follow along at home. And for the first time when we do that, we will have a technology job description that does not differentiate people based upon did you go to college or not and have a degree, and also based on tenure. It will be purely a skills-based assessment of your capabilities. And so we're going to go through that with all of these things. And we're using actually, once we do that, then we're also standing up an AI set of software alongside that so that we don't have to go through this process manually again. So just so you have a sense, when I first asked my team about this, in the absence of technology, they said it'll take us about 10 or 15 years to redo all of these classifications, which blew my mind away. And I was like, this is crazy. We're going to try to do all these classifications in 18 months. And then, as I said, we're going to put them into a software system where as the agencies or as we determine, hey, you know what? We had this competency, but it turns out that's outdated. The real competency is, I'm making this up, can you model in Excel, right? Maybe that's not a competency we want. We can actually then, kind of the AI will basically incorporate that and update the qualification standards, as automatically as possible, obviously with human oversight, but so that we don't literally have to take, an IO psychologist 12 months to go figure out all of how all these things work. So anyway, so that's a long way of saying we're going to do that. And then the other piece we're going to do, the other kind of bane that people have is then, the agencies have to create job descriptions, as you probably know, based on those classifications, which again, today's a very manual process. We have an AI tool that we're about to release also which will, let's call it human assist via AI, the development of job descriptions, right? And again, it will learn and it will say, great, okay, last time you said this was here. Is that still relevant or not? Or why have you changed it? So something that kind of creates that process. So when we're all said and done, what I hope we do is we have a whole set of job classifications where merit principles actually determine whether you're, get the job or not. We have a whole set of tests and assessments, right? Some of which might be more general kind of skills assessments like, do you know how to, do a presentation? Can you communicate a complex idea? Mm-hmm. And others, where appropriate, might be more technical assessments, right? Like, can you do software development work? Do you know how to be a nurse if you're applying to be a nurse at the VA, right? Do you have the requisite technical skills?
Kind of helps onboarding too. When you're
right. That's exactly right. And then the end result of all that is we shorten the hiring process, we make it much easier, and also we make sure that kind of if you are well-skilled, that we can level you appropriately in the organization so we can pay you what we believe your skills determine. But what I can do, as I said, is I can substitute proxies for skills for assessments of skills so that I can actually level people appropriately for what their skills determination is.
So I want to talk about modernization.
Yeah.
I want to switch gears and talk about, because it's an important part of your agenda. And I'm wondering if you could tell us how are you modernizing OPM's human capital IT infrastructure to support efficiency. But, really what I'm getting at is your long-term vision for modernization coupled with the idea to avoid the pitfalls that have happened before around these big modernization efforts around technology. Can you share with us your vision?
So let me give you a couple of thoughts on that. So again, when I think about modernization, it goes back to me, that original goal we talked about, which is, to me, the goal of modernization is, does it enable us to deliver a higher quality of service over time at hopefully at least a flat or declining cost, or certainly not a just purely linear increasing cost, right? So that to me is kind of what the goal of all these are, is higher quality service at hopefully lower unit cost. So a couple of just comments on, I think, where these projects go are difficult. Number one is, I'll give you an example. As you know, we manage the retirement services, right? And so we started building in January, right after the administration, something called the Online Retirement Application, ORA. We now actually have more than 120,000 people who've gone through ORA now. And what we did, which was different, which I'm thrilled we did, was two things. One is we kind of cordoned off a small development team that worked with our CIO organization, but was not 100% embedded in that organization. And again, this is to me like an organizational challenge problem, which is the CIO organizations in these agencies have so much responsibility to make sure the systems don't go down, that we have robust security, all the things we need. I think it's very hard for them to do these development projects because there's a different motion between trying to roll out new software development at the same time you're trying to maintain security, infrastructure, and all these other things. And again, that's not an indictment of any of the people there. I just think these are just organizational dynamics that are real. So number one was, we said we're going to have the development team is going to be a small team, and then they will interface where appropriate, of course, with the rest of the CIO team because there's integration into existing systems and all that other stuff. But we need to kind of, make sure that we don't let them to kind of get consumed by, all those day-to-day runtime obligations. Two, which we do all the time in the private sector, and I believe we never do in the public sector, is we're just going to take an iterative development process. And what I mean by that is not if you think about building a new product, and we see this in our startup companies all the time, right? We have this concept of a minimum viable product, MVP is what we call it, right? And the idea is, okay, I'm the product manager of my company. I don't really know exactly what you need as a user, and I can go sit in a room and study it for 24 months, or I can start to figure out what I think the initial use cases are. Then I can put something in your hands. Then you give me the feedback. And quite frankly, we're doing what I would call scientific method, right? Which is, okay, we have a hypothesis of how you might use my technology. We establish a test, an experiment to test that hypothesis. We get the feedback, and then quite frankly, we iterate.
Mm-hmm. So more of an agile method, rather.
It is, yeah. I mean, agile specifically tends to refer to kind of what they call these sprints, which are stuff. I'm talking about not just doing sprints, but I'm talking about literally putting a product in the hands of a customer that the honest answer is we know is not the final product. Yeah. Okay. And
but you want their reaction.
Yes,
you want that
exactly.
engagement.
Right. And so we did this with ORA, with the online retirement application. And we said it, by the way, to all the HRs who said, look, we know this isn't a 100% perfect product yet, but like we want to get it out there because we're going to learn a ton from how you use it. And then that will kind of create the requirements document for us to do the next iteration. And we've done that. And so that's the other reason I think why a lot of these government projects fail is we try to boil the ocean and we do these things forever. But, one of the things I've learned from the venture capital business is you're kidding yourself if you think you actually know what all the requirements are for a product unless and until you put it in the hands of users and you let them tell you kind of what you're missing and what needs to change in order to make this kind of useful to them. And so that's, I think, a big sea change that we're trying to do. We just released a new data product on employee data called FWD, Federal Workforce Database, I think is what it's called. It replaced what used to be called FedScope, I think.
That's right.
And we did the same thing. And literally in the blog post when I announced it, I said, hey, look, I'm telling you, I know this product isn't 100% there, but like we're putting it out because we think this is a respectable starting point for us to get it in your hands. And you should tell us like this is bad or like this doesn't work with how I'm doing it. And then that will drive the requirements for us going forward.
This has been the Business of Government Hour, a conversation with Scott Kupor, Director of the U.S. Office of Personnel Management, OPM. Be sure to join us next time for another informative, insightful, and in-depth conversation on improving government leadership and its effectiveness. Until then, subscribe, download, and listen to the entire interview at Apple Podcast, Spotify, Audible, or on your favorite podcast app, and as always at businessofgovernment.org.